If you've been studying management accounting, you may have come across this abbreviation, BEP. This stands for break-even point. The break-even point describes a certain business condition, and we often calculate it using the assumptions we learned about under cost volume profit analysis. The business condition it describes is when operating income equals zero for the business. Before we go further, let's make sure we're clear about what is meant by operating income, at least according to many management accounting and cost accounting textbooks. Operating income. It's calculated as follows. If we take revenues and subtract variable costs, we get contribution margin. From that, we can subtract our fixed costs, and the result is known as operating income. Now, break-even point describes a situation where the operating income is equal to zero. Said another way, total revenues subtract variable and fixed costs equals zero. Let's do a numerical example. Let SPU equals selling price per unit of $21, VCU equals variable cost per unit of $11, Q for the number of units, which will be 1,000, and FC for the fixed costs, which we will set to $10,000. Now, if we were to do the math, $21 selling price per unit multiplied by 1,000 units gives us total revenues of $21,000. A variable cost per unit of $11 multiplied by 1,000 units gives us a variable cost of $11,000. The contribution margin then is $10,000, and fixed costs are given at $10,000, meaning operating income is zero. As a reminder, this is true for this business under these conditions at a level of sales of 1,000 units. Now, how would you describe the break-even point? What is the language you would use to describe break-even? For this example, we could do it in a few ways. We could focus at the very top at revenues. We could say the break-even point is when sales revenues are at $21,000 for this business under these conditions. Or we could describe it by looking at the very bottom, the number of units. We could say the break-even point is when sales are at 1,000 units, again, for this business under these conditions. Now let's talk about something interesting with respect to the math. Once again, as a reminder, we are taking our revenues, subtracting our variable costs and our fixed costs, and that has to equal zero. In this example, it's 21,000, subtract 11,000, subtract 10,000. If we take a look at revenues, subtract variable costs, this gives us a contribution margin of $10,000. Notice that the fixed costs are also $10,000. This is the interesting thing to me. The break-even point is when the contribution margin is equal to fixed costs. So now we've calculated the break-even point, and we've got different ways to talk about it. The example on the left, to make sure we are very clear, we have revenues of 21,000, variable costs of 11. That gives us a contribution margin of 10,000. Fixed costs are 10,000, which gives us an operating income of $0. All of that is true for this business at 1,000 units. So the break-even point is when operating income equals zero. We can prove that, one, mathematically, or we could describe it by discussing the sales revenue in total dollars, or we can describe it by discussing the number of units when operating income is set to zero. And we also notice something interesting about the math, that the break-even point is when the contribution margin equals the fixed costs. So these are different ways to discuss it and to think about it. Now, some people want it to be a bit more visual. So you could imagine a seesaw or a little teeter-totter. And when we have revenues that are equal to the variable costs and the fixed costs, everything breaks even. But this is a management accounting course, so we've got to get back to the math. And I'd like to break this equation down further. So first, let's just spread everything out so we have some space. And I'll use the variables VC for variable costs and FC for fixed costs. And we'll look at revenue on the left. Let's break that down first. Revenues can be broken down further into the selling price per unit multiplied by the number of units. Variable costs can be broken down further by looking at the variable cost per unit and multiplying that by the number of units. This part of the equation can be simplified. We can break this down or simplify it to say, if we take our selling price per unit and subtract our variable cost per unit, and we'll put this in brackets so it's clear that this needs to be done first, we then multiply this by the quantity of units. The rest of the equation will remain the same. We can still simplify this further. The selling price per unit and the variable cost per unit will reduce down to the contribution margin per unit. And we can multiply that by the number of units. The rest of the equation remains the same. Now, if we were to focus in on this equation, you might be wondering, well, why is this even useful? Well, we can rearrange it and simplify it further. If we were to add fixed costs to both sides, it would simplify to this. Contribution margin per unit multiplied by the number of units equals the fixed costs. And then we can isolate the quantity by dividing both sides by the contribution margin per unit. And now we get the quantity is equal to the fixed costs divided by the contribution margin per unit. This is known as the BEQ, or the break-even quantity. The break-even point in units, BEQ, is equal to the fixed cost divided by the contribution margin per unit. Let's do another example where operating income isn't zero to see if we can calculate the break-even point using this equation. We'll let selling price per unit still equal $21. Variable cost per unit will still be $11, but we'll change the quantity. We'll say that the level of sales now is 3,000 units instead of 1,000 units earlier. Please make note of that difference. Fixed costs will remain fixed at $10,000. So let's do the math. Revenues will be $21 multiplied by 3,000 units. That's 63,000. Variable costs, $11 multiplied by 3,000 units is 33,000. So the contribution margin is $30,000. If we subtract the fixed costs of 10,000, operating income is equal to 20,000. Remember, all of this is true for this situation where sales are now at 3,000 units. How do we go from here to figuring out the break-even quantity or the break-even point for this particular scenario? Well, we can go ahead and bring in that equation we were working on earlier. The break-even quantity is equal to the fixed costs divided by the contribution margin per unit. Let's just put our numbers right onto the equation. Fixed costs will equal $10,000 a unit. Divide that by the contribution margin per unit, which is $30,000 divided by 3,000 units, or $10 a unit. Another way to calculate that, we could take $21 a unit, subtract $11 a unit, and that would also equal $10 a unit. 10,000 divided by $10 equals 1,000 units. Now, we could very quickly calculate the break-even in dollars by taking 1,000 units and multiplying that by the $21 per unit. There's another way to do that too. Let's look at it. To do it, we have to calculate something called the contribution margin percentage. The contribution margin percentage is equal to the contribution margin per unit divided by the selling price per unit. If we put some numbers on this, the contribution margin per unit was $21 subtract 11, or $10 a unit, divided by $21 a unit, and this will equal about 47.62%. So we can take that percentage to calculate our break-even in terms of revenue. Break-even revenue will be equal to our fixed costs, which was $10,000, divided by the contribution margin percentage that we just calculated, 47.62%. And that will equal $21,000. Let's summarize. If you see BEP in management accounting, they are referring to the break-even point. The break-even point is calculated using the key assumptions we learned about in cost volume profit analysis, and it's generally describing a scenario where the operating income for the business equals 0. We discussed the break-even point, or we learned to describe it, 1, mathematically. 2, the break-even point can be expressed in dollars of total revenue. 3, the break-even point can be expressed in units, the break-even quantity. And then we noticed an interesting mathematical relationship. 4, the break-even point is when the contribution margin is equal to fixed costs. I hope you found this video helpful. Until next time, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and may your journey be joyful.
There are some costs that never change, no matter how much you rearrange. They're always there, day or night. Fixed costs keep us steady with a simple goal in sight. Let's find the break-even point where we won't fall. No profit, no loss, just covering it all with fixed costs. Contribution to, we'll see how many units we need to make and sell through. Every unit that we sell has a cost that varies as well. Subtract it from how much we get, that's our margin, don't forget. Let's find the break-even, a point where we won't fall. No profit, no loss, just covering it all with fixed costs. Contribution to, we'll see how many units we need to make and sell through. Now take those fixed costs, keep them in view, divide by the margin, that's how we do. That's how many we need to sell to cover it all just swell. To understand the flow of dough, break-even is important to know. Let's find the break-even where we stand tall. No profit, no loss, just covering it all with fixed costs. Contribution to, we'll see how many units we need to make and sell through. So when you're planning, just keep in mind, break-even helps you stay aligned. With fixed costs clear and margins tight, you'll break even and then take flight. Let's find the break-even, or where we stand tall. No profit, no loss, just covering it all with fixed costs. Contribution to, we'll see how many units we need to make and sell through.